Hi and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez, your podcast host. As always, I'd like to thank my guests for giving up their time to record conversations with me about this thing called leadership. And I'd also like to thank today's guest in particular. And as always, by way of background, today's guest is the Chief Connector, Coach and host of Safety on Tap and is also the Executive Officer of the Rural Safety and Health Alliance. I welcome to the podcast Andrew Barrett, and I began by asking Andrew about his pathway to leadership. So without further delay, over to Andrew. Your pathway to being an entrepreneurial leader, can you give us a bit of a sense of what that looks like, mate?
Sure. So leader started before my memory, my adult memory at least. I think leadership is one of those things that people take, not given or bestowed by a title or whatnot. So I can remember as early as being like 5 years old and getting my parents to help me with writing a letter to our local council because they were clearing the reeds in the little creek down the end of our street. And I was worried about the ducks that lived there. So, you know, in terms of taking a position on something and leading change in particular, it kind of goes back as early as that. And so I think that it's not something that I was born with. It's just something I chose. And so leadership is not a trait like your hair color, like your eye color. Your hair color can change. But leadership is just something that you continue to lean into. And so, yeah, I don't know, it started at 4 or 5 for me. Have had the normal sorts of leadership positions growing up in terms of sporting leadership, captaincies and things like that, in terms of at school organizing things, as well as being in formal leadership positions like school captain and whatnot. And then in work, I realized that there's a big difference between positional power and authority and leadership as well. So it's just leadership, making the choice to be a leader has been something that I can't remember not ever doing. Now, entrepreneurship, though, on the other hand, is a different sort of thing. 5-6 years ago, I decided that I would leave my very very well paid, good condition sort of corporate job working in workplace health and safety, which is my professional field, because I decided that 2 things were happening. One was that I needed a little less constraint. I needed a lot more rope than anyone was prepared to give me, and people gave me a lot of rope. And so I also decided that there were ways of making change in the world that being in an organization, in a job, having a boss, corporate culture, all that sort of stuff, were just not prepared to take risks on. So I thought, well, I might as well do that myself as a hypothesis, this might work, let's try it out. And my wife was beautiful enough to allow me to take that risk, to gamble with our livelihood, if you like. So she has more than a full-time job looking after them. So one income, doing that, launching out on your own is a big deal. So that was the beginning of my entrepreneurship, really, which was deciding that there were different and better ways to make change in the world. And in my context, it's improving workplace health and safety.
That decision to jump from working for someone, and again, you did mention that they gave you latitude to do what you wanted to do, but not enough to do what you really wanted to do. Was that triggered by, and again, without mentioning previous employers, was it an event? Was it an incident? Was it something that triggered that, or was it a series of different things that got you to that decision point?
That's a really good question. I don't think it was a distinct thing. I think it kind of grows over time because you inevitably go through this process. When you're a change leader, you inevitably go through this process where you are continually testing hypotheses. I'm going to try this thing and see if it gives the result that I'm looking for. And so I learned a lot as a change maker in my jobs, in my work, about what did and didn't work. So I found the boundaries. And so I think that was a learning experience over many, many years and many, many experiments of micro experiments of conversations that do or don't go well, all the way through to major national infrastructure safety programs, which was the last job that I had was at the National Broadband Network. So it definitely wasn't a particular thing that led me to that. No.
So let's talk about the entrepreneurial side of things. Is it as lonely as you make it, or is it a solo pathway that you've chosen when you choose to become an entrepreneur and do your own thing, mate?
Yeah, it's a really great question. The general answer is, yeah, it's lonely, but it's not the textbook definition of lonely or the school kids sitting on the bench all by themselves kind of lonely sense. The way that I distinguish a business owner from an entrepreneur, and this is probably not the textbook definition, so this is just the way that I think about it, is that many people who call themselves entrepreneurs are business owners, which just means that they run a business and have to do extra tax, but they otherwise have a job. It's just a job with a different kind of business structure. An entrepreneur, I think, is someone who takes far greater risks, and innovation is a far greater underpinning foundation, if you like, for the way that they make money. So that's probably an important distinction to make at the beginning. Now, what that means then is when you're innovating and when you're taking really big risks, you do find yourself on the edges, because you're looking for boundaries and you're generally trying to push beyond boundaries. And that's a metaphorical boundary in whatever the status quo is in your context. So in my context, for example, health and safety is known for bureaucratic, over the top, controlling, waste of time stuff, which is totally disconnected from its outcome, right? Health and safety is about people going home better than they were at the beginning of the day. So in that sense, that's a boundary that we found and we need to push beyond. Health and safety is also about learning. It's about improving by improving outcomes and performance by improving how we learn. And yet we do lots of things in the name of safety, like risk assessments or incident investigations, or God forbid anyone who's listening has ever been part of a safety committee. These sorts of things are well-intentioned, but they don't deliver learning outcomes. And so they're kind of a couple of examples in my context of where you find a boundary. And what that means is that when you've got most people who operate at the center, at the average, at the mean, in the middle of the normal curve, however you want to, kind of picture that in your mind, then yeah, you're on the edge, you're on the outer, and you're often heretical in that sense. So it is lonely, not only because there are few of us doing it, it's also lonely because people drive a wedge there. They love, especially with social media, they love attacking people who try different things or who maybe say that this, that, or the other way of thinking or acting maybe doesn't serve us anymore, because people they defend the status quo, So in that sense, I don't know, does that give you a sense of the style of loneliness that I've embraced?
Yeah, it doesn't sound too lonely, mate. In fact, I think you get a sick pleasure in being the heretic and
well, you find, like Seth Godin says, you find people. So when you are there, though, it feels lonely, but you attract the others. And by the others, it's the ones who they're out there. I know that people can't see this because it's a podcast, right? But put your hand to your forehead. Imagine that you're the captain on the ship and you're staring out off the bow into the dark ocean, the horizon you can't see. And some people like to stand on the bow and look for the light. Look for the tiniest little glimmer of light that might be out there to guide them. And so in that sense, you're right. It feels lonely a lot of the time, but you do attract those people who are looking for that light.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant answer. One thing around this idea of breaking with the status quo or the norm, or having heretical thought, social media opens you up to a lot of different people that want to attack that, because there's always a vested interest in doing what you have to do to stay part of the status quo. And in the health and safety field, and now I've experienced it in multiple industries. My first experience of it, and it was fairly new at the time, but pretty much drilled into every site I went on, was I worked in the building and construction trades with my old man while I was still at uni studying, and health and safety was the thing on every site. Like, you had to do the same induction for every damn site that you did. It's like, couldn't you have learnt this the first time and then had a certificate that said you're good for 5 years or you're good for a year? But different companies, same rigmarole, but it was almost like they didn't believe we had the capacity to learn what that meant on a given site. The common sense wasn't given any place. So, sorry for the diversion for those listening, but health and safety is a particular bugbear of mine, because I've been on the receiving end. I claim no expertise in the field, unlike my guest, but we could talk about that for a long time. But let's get back to this now.
That's why I'm on the mission, Eric.
Yeah, no, mate, keep going. Please keep going. We need more heretics out there. Let me ask you this. It sounds like you've met a lot of people in your travels and in the OH&S space, in that safety space. I'm sure that you have. What could you give me a list, a comparison, if you could quickly, maybe top 3 capabilities that a leader has versus an entrepreneur in your travels? You can use yourself or things that you look for in an effective leader or an effective entrepreneur.
Versus. I hate the word versus.
And
Creates. I have a podcast episode called Versus or a comma. And anyway, so I won't draw a dichotomy if that's okay with you.
Yeah. And I'm not when I ask that, when I use that word, and I understand why you went there, for me, it's more, I just want to compare without making a value judgment between the two, because the two for me, and this again, for those listening, it's only my view. I think there are some very key distinctions between leaders and entrepreneurs. And part of the reason for doing this podcast is to get views like yours, Andrew, on it. So yeah, I'm asking just from your experience, what do you believe are those key capabilities from a leader perspective and then an entrepreneurial one?
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, leaders are people who take others along a journey with them. It's not about directing anyone to do something or controlling what people do in terms of being in charge or providing direction. So leadership's really, really important. You've got to have followers. You've got to have people who are coming along with you on the journey and in the direction that you're heading. Entrepreneurs, I mentioned before, I think the big distinction for me is just the extent of the risk that they take. And that's risk at lots of different levels. That's financial risk, that's innovation risk, that's technological risk, personal risk, brand risk, and it's going to be different for different entrepreneurs. So using social media is a good example, right? So I take a huge amount of brand risk associated with being a guy who sticks my head up above the parapet and I say, this is what I believe, this is what I think, these are the results I get people, or this is how I help people, and I think this other stuff is crap, or I think this other stuff doesn't work. So, so I think the amount of risk that you take as an entrepreneur is one of the distinguishing features. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Very much so. Okay, so just some points of clarification here. When you've been out, and I want to use a workplace example if I can. So when you've been out in former life onto work sites and you've seen what good and bad leadership or good and not effective leadership looks like, what do you typically see? Because one of the things I want to expand in my understanding of, and those listening, understanding of the leadership function, and we'll contrast that if we can with entrepreneurial ism, because I'm sure you've been a lot of entrepreneurs, is what does good and bad look like for you, mate? Effective and not so effective, if we can use that terminology.
Yeah, cool. I'd probably summarize effective leadership with the phrase people-centric or human-centric, probably to take it even further. So again, I'll draw a contrast here for you. Health and safety and management and business structure in general is designed around this idea that we will take resources, whether that be widgets or something you've dug out of the ground or a tree that you've cut down or, an input. You then put it through a process and then you create a product or a service at the end of that. The traditional view of business, or the predominant view of business at the moment, is one of a mechanical analogy or metaphor, if you like. It's a machine. So you put stuff in, it does something to it. It has moving parts and parts interact with each other. And then something spits out at the end, a result, a function, a product or whatever. So what happens is that we struggle with leadership when we treat people like the parts in the machine, interchangeable parts that we get rid of when they're worn or broken. So think about the workers' compensation system, right? What we do is we say, well, a machine has particular tolerances or limits of function, right? So you know that this cog needs to be this size and that thickness and that strength, etc. And so what happens then is that we try and get people to standardize and to fit into that. Now, people, I don't know about you, but people are the most diverse, amazing, interesting, and changing creatures on the entire planet. And so they're nothing like parts of a machine. And yet what we do is we try and design and run businesses like people are parts in a machine. So that lack of human or people centricity, I think, is the root of so many problems, not just in health and safety, but in leadership and in business in general. Does that make sense?
I'm going to steal that the metaphor there about cogs in a machine, because that it's quite a telling view of the world. That when you're trying to interact in a workspace, that you're trying to fit people with various different views of the world and ways of operating to try and fit the machine you've created or the system you've created, and it's sometimes it doesn't quite work. So yeah, no, the analogy is quite a good one.
Can I give you an alternative one?
Sure.
So the normal alternative to that is that people say, well, we'll think about an organization as an organism then, or as an ecosystem, right? Like it's some part of nature. Now, that's not bad, but I think we can actually go even further. I have found that the most useful metaphor for thinking about the way that people interact, organizations, and when I say organization, I mean, if you're from a community group or you're thinking about your, the P&C at school or something like that, that the most useful metaphor is that humans interact through dialogue, through conversation, through words and language and things that I say and things that you say, and then we make meaning together. That's exactly what you and I are doing now, Eric. So if we actually think about organizations simply as a collection of conversations, of dialogue, then we have a very different worldview for how we can actually change things. So great example of that is in an organization that is like a machine, then the mechanic of the machine, which is usually the senior managers, will make decisions about which parts are working, which parts aren't working, where maintenance goes, whether we're going to cut a part off or take a part of the machine off because it's not efficient anymore, etc. Yeah, that's top down, standard management change. If you think about it as a collection of conversations, though, you then say, well, what if we were in dialogue? What if there was dialogue between senior managers in an organization and the people at the front line who do the work? Now that's unheard of, right? And we have all these stories, the HBR articles that talk about the filtering that happens from the front line of workers all the way through to senior management. And then you have all of these big corporate collapses and major problems with information security, or even if you think about the Catholic Church, child sex abuse or whatever it is in these organizations. And the people at the top go, I didn't know. And they didn't know, right? Because of this filtering effect. So what if we just thought about organizations as collections of conversations? And then what we do is we say, okay, well, what would a conversation look like if it was between this person and that person? And it totally changes the dynamic of what's possible.
Mate, that's another another thought bubble I might steal off you. I mean,
boom.
this makes it's quite a different way to look at what leadership and entrepreneurialism is, because I think the traditional thought around what these two functions are is that the higher up and the more responsibility and the more the title brings. So for some, the title EO, chief executive director, whatever the title is, governor, chair, whatever, president. I don't mean US president, just president of an organization. That we gear our organizational systems to compartmentalize the top from the bottom. And the assumption is always, well, the top only needs to know a certain amount, and then the levels underneath need to take care of those other conversations. And yeah, the having a non-filter between those, to me, sounds reasonable. How you operationalize that, the bigger the organization gets, I think it gets a lot more difficult, but there'd be ways around it. And from my travels, I've seen in small to very small organizations, which I've tended to work for, when you've got not many layers and then a board, or not many layers and a chief executive, that those conversations are easily facilitated, and it just makes the workflow quicker. The bigger you get, I think the more difficult you get. And I think we, just as human beings, we like to create little departments for ourselves that hive us off from having those conversations, because sometimes I think there's a difficulty in speaking truth to power, and that's I think one of the issues with leadership or entrepreneurialism, is that those that you're leading or those that are following you as an entrepreneur are there to help you realize a goal or your dream as a social entrepreneur, as a mainstream entrepreneur, as in not for a social cause. Like I would make a distinction between someone like a Richard Branson's of the world, or the Elon Musks, versus those that are in the not-for-profit sector that are entrepreneurs that are doing social entrepreneurialism. That even in those settings, it's difficult to talk to the person up the top because you don't want to rock the boat. And so I think it's incumbent, maybe, I'll get your view on this, it's incumbent on the leader or the entrepreneur to build an environment that allows people to ask a question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I don't think it's just questions. Like, I'm a coach and have done a lot of work in the coaching and mentoring space. And one of the most powerful and underutilized things that I would love to explore with people one day and bring more to the world, it's a little bit further down the track, I think, in terms of people's readiness, is this idea of self-coaching and reverse coaching. So it's this idea of saying, like, even just who's asking the question is relevant. So I would say, is there a greater opportunity for a frontline worker, tool in hand, raw material product, whatever it is, behind the wheel of the truck, whatever it is there more opportunity for the CEO to learn from the driver about the organization and its goals and its mission and what they're trying to do, or for the what did I say first? For the worker to learn from the CEO, or from the CEO to learn from the worker? In my experience, if senior managers shut up and they actually ask more questions, they learn more, because questions are a learning tool, right? So I don't even think it's about frontline workers asking questions, although that's useful. I mean, if you take the lead of people like Ricardo Semler from Semco in Brazil, 30 years ago, he started he took over his organization from his father. And he said, you know what, it doesn't make sense that we're not engaging in this dialogue with the people who do the work, because we want them to be happy. We want them to stay here, and we want to know what's going on, as opposed to all of the stuff that gets hidden. And so they ended up in a position where they had every board meeting, they had 2 employee spots on the board. And whoever rocked up first to the meeting, any employee could sit on the board with decision authority, and they taught them how to read the balance sheet and all that sort of stuff, because that's a very simple structural way to enable that dialogue to happen. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's an awesome opportunity for that kind of dialogue to flow more in an organization, but it might not just be top to bottom, right? So think about a supply chain. Think about the dialogue that happens between a client and a customer, or say government and their supplier, or between a principal contractor in construction and their subcontractors. The contract, kind of almost by default, it doesn't actually create these constraints. We created the constraints to learning and dialogue, because there's a contract on the table between us. It's bullshit. Sometimes when you actually get more dialogue flowing, you all improve collectively together. But I'll get off my high horse now.
No, that's great, mate. It sounds like you put some thought into this, and yeah, I agree. I think that breaking of those barriers is something that is not the norm. It definitely isn't, and it's how do you? It's almost like you're having a conversation at one level, and I can understand that now. But I think the other way that I would look at what you've just said is, how do you teach businesses to be able to pivot and be more strategically capable to move and do things differently in their businesses? And if you've only thought one way for the whole time you've operated, and you don't want to move from a certain model of thinking, it's very difficult to do. And those industries and those businesses exist. The ones
which is most of them. I mean, what's the number one thing that we get taught at school? The number one thing we get taught at school is that there's a difference between the people sitting on the little chairs and the person standing up the front. Yeah. And then the next thing we get taught is that our job, our success, will come from mostly sitting down and shutting up and doing what you're told. That's still what school does today. And again, Seth Godin has been a massive influence on me. He talks a lot about this. So anyone who wants to kind of riff off that, go and check out Seth Godin's work. So I totally, we have to have empathy for people, because we have, for the last 100 years, churned out managers and leaders and people who end up being CEOs from that kind of way of thinking and looking at the world. And so I'm not saying that we need to dismantle all of that stuff, because without structure and control and direction and contracts or whatever, the world won't work. But what I am saying is that we need to entertain that it's possible there's an alternative hypothesis.
Success, Andrew, let me ask you, what does it look like for you?
Oh, that's a really great question.
Mate, I don't get paid the big bucks for nothing.
Success is funny. I don't actually like the word success in general. And the reason for that is that if you've heard of James Cass's Finite and Infinite Games, he and Dr. Jason Fox is another guy, an Australian guy who's written on this as well, is that most of the time what we're doing is we're playing an infinite game when it comes to career, business, self-fulfillment, parenting, whatever. It's an infinite game, which means that the purpose of the game is to keep playing the game, is to do the things that require that enable the players to stay in the game. Whereas a finite game is like a sporting game where there are rules and there are boundaries, and it starts and it finishes. So in that sense, I don't like success, because success suggests that it's a finite game. Oh, we're done. And this is the problem with metrics and targets and whatnot in business. And don't get me started on that. They give a sense of achievement, which is done. Let's move on. And so I don't like success. I actually like meaningful progress. alternatively. And again, Dr. Jason Fox, I'll credit with the inspiration there. So what meaningful progress means to me is actually measured by the results that I help other people get. So I have the opportunity to provide input to a book that's being written about safety improvements that have been achieved through the design of work, right? So instead of safety being paperwork and training and crap like that, it's about making work better, designing work better. And so when in my time at NBN, as a safety leader, we enabled some relatively straightforward changes to the design of the physical infrastructure of that network, the wires and the poles and the pipes that go underground and the cabinets that sit on the side of the road. And because of those few changes that we're able to make with the designers at the right time in the life cycle, with the right justification and risk assessment and cost and all that sort of stuff, I know that I have personally, this is the only safety improvement I can ever claim personally, that I've personally reduced the risk to those people who work on that infrastructure for the life of that network, which is probably 50 years. And that's thousands and thousands of workers. So in that sense, my measure of meaningful progress has nothing to do with me. It's about the impact that I'm making in the world. And what I get really, really addicted to is the opportunity for scale. It's the longest lever for the smallest change. It's the 80-20. So in that sense, in my current context, I help organizations implement better learning practices to improve safety and operational performance. So we actually operationalize this learning stuff. It's not just kind of feel good stuff. And my success is, or my meaningful progress is measured by the success of my clients. So we trialed a pilot program for people implementing a particular learning practice. It doesn't matter what it is. And that would traditionally have been implemented by training people, 3 days in a hotel conference room, overdosing on breath mints and freezing their asses off. And change just wasn't coming from that. Or reading books, right? And like, again, I'm Seth Godin, third reference. He says, if you want to learn to ride a bike, don't watch a video, don't read a book. And so as a coach, I said, well, what if we coached people through this process? So we've been getting great results for people who've never heard of this particular learning practice before. And we help them get the result that they want inside of 10 weeks. And that's that. The numbers don't really matter, but what you need to know is that that's an amazing achievement from a standing start. And so we're looking to scale that this year. That's the kind of meaningful progress that I measure, because that's the only thing that actually I want to drive, and everything else is secondary to that in terms of my satisfaction and my professional development and my sense of connection and all that sort of stuff. It's all secondary to the results other people get.
And thank you for that response, mate. It's very consistent with what others in the podcast have said to me, that their measures of success are not necessarily monetary or meeting their KPIs, but being able to help someone else progress their careers, or getting that leg up for the next person, or training their replacement so that they can move on and this person can move up and they can do other things. And that it's a very altruistic way to look at the world, and not I don't think all leaders or entrepreneurs look at it in that way, but yeah, it's very consistent with what I'm hearing, and it may be my sample that I've picked leaders that were always going to say that anyway, but I think it's worth reiterating that, it's important that measures of success aren't just financial or aren't just KPIs. I think for your own sense of positive mental health, that it's good that you can do for somebody else, because I've always looked at leadership as being of service to others, and that kind of what you're saying in a roundabout way. I mean, the core of it is there, that your measure of success is others, and that the game is a continuing thing. It's not a stop-start thing and you stop learning, or once one thing's finished, you go on to the next, which is the world of business. Let me ask you, Andrew, leaders, entrepreneurs, are they born or made? Let's start with leaders. Do you think they're born or made, mate?
No, made.
Okay. Entrepreneurs?
Same thing.
Okay. Why?
I think, I don't know. My experience is that when you look at, say, Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset, which some people might have heard of. If you've got kids, they're talking about it more in schools at the moment. It distinguishes, there was this huge study that was done on what are the variables that seem to predict the difference between adults being successful from the very beginning of their life. And I won't probably do the research justice by summarizing it here. But what they found is that they distinguished the characteristics of people who are described as having a growth mindset and those people who are described as having a fixed mindset. And so the growth mindset people just simply say, well, I haven't succeeded yet, or I haven't achieved my goal yet. And I'm going to actually work on, finding the resources, developing the skills, connecting with the right people, whatever it is, in order to move that forward. And other people say, well, my locus of control, to use the psychological term, is external. It's COVID. It's my upbringing. It's the color of my skin. It's, how much money I've got right now, or whatever it is. And so that's a major distinguishing feature, I think. So the research tends to suggest that it's possible to change that. Now, people who start with fixed mindsets, it is, again, it's not like the color of their eyes. It can change. It's hard work, but it's hard. It's like, people who are overweight can lose weight. They just got to work harder than other people with fast metabolisms. You know what I mean? So I am very definitively in the you are made, not born.
Advice would you give a younger version of yourself about being an effective entrepreneur?
Two things, if I may. The first one is, ironically, slow down. So I think you need to slow down to speed up. I am perpetually in a hurry and impatient, and that doesn't always bode well for getting the best results for your physical and mental health, for engaging other people in the journey you're going on. So slow down continues to be the thing that I remind myself about. And the second one is shut up. I have always been that kid who was like, just couldn't, could talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles. And so I would have accelerated my journey and the impact I'm making in the world if I had spent less time talking and more time listening, or asking questions maybe, but mostly listening.
Thanks again to Andrew for his time, and this is the final podcast for February of 2021. I particularly enjoyed this podcast given it was leadership from that health and safety lens, so I really do thank Andrew for his time and insights, particularly around creating some shared meaning in the workplace, and that definitely has to come from the leader. So a lot more content to come in March and beyond. As always, please support the podcast through Podbean or through the YouTube channel. And if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to help me grow the channel. Have a great rest of the weekend, and I'll catch you all in March for a lot more talking leadership content. See ya.